Welcome to the new Kevin Smith, the Great Witness Show. The new adventure series is. You're here with Dean Kevin, and I'm Dean Val, and we're going to hear from Dean Kevin today about some real side experiences he had and see if we can become more aware from them. So welcome, Kevin, again. It's always good to have you here.
In this real side experience, I would find myself in my physical level house recreated on the real side. Our physical level houses represent generally the personal self, the consciousness therefore, and as most houses are generally too flawed, as the representation goes, the first floor is the personal self, that which we are conscious of, and the second floor represents the unseen parts or aspects of the self and the life levels they correspond with, from the astral to the etheric. The second floor then would be the parts of the self, the dimensions of creation most are unconscious of, and as everything starts on the real side, through the unseen aspects of the personal self, including all ideas, thoughts, intents of others, etc., so can we often be shown this, that which would feature then on the second floor of the recreated physical level houses. For the unconscious unaware, the one-dimensional individual, they would only have the view of the first floor, that which they are conscious of, that which has filtered from the unseen parts of themselves and life dimensions to the physical, as everything must, if agreement to it is maintained. So these views can afford us vital information and warnings of that which is impacting us from the unseen parts of life, which will become so on the physical, and should it be then some variety of attack or taplining, what will follow, if not addressed, will be physical level illnesses and ailments, cancers, and maybe even death. Very often I am shown creatures and individuals of ill intent that through agreement somewhere, be it conscious or subconscious, are infringing on my experience through the other aspects and dimensions of the self beyond the physical, that if not confronted, if the agreement or attachment that is facilitating their ill-intended presence is not faced and then released, so will they continue to impact the personal self according to their agendas and decided consciousness. Many a time will subconscious agreements that potentially may facilitate attacks in accordance with an abrasive consciousness we have extended agreement to, be represented by the creatures and characters lurking in parts of the second floors of our houses that would be construed as storage areas, the areas out of the way from the main bedrooms, etc., such as the attic, and indeed the back garden generally represents the subconscious also. as with an experience Dwayne shared regarding an individual whose subconscious attachments to Joni and Harold presented them as hiding in the closet on the second floor, and when agreement and decision was made to release this tap line, so the guides would enter and remove them from the closet and the house. As the real awareness, life and the real guides will always do what makes sense with life and awareness wise. Remove any individuals that are representing a detriment to our awareness process, but can only do so if we decide. If the personal self releases the tap lines, and if not, then we are free will deciding to experience the imposition or attack, and nothing can take this from us if we choose to cling on to such tap lines, as the deciders always of our experience. We add the idea files to the consciousness. We must then experience whatever the nature of the idea may be. If it is an abrasive consciousness, then we are deciding to experience such a consciousness, which will express as it will in our simulation according to its construction. It's really a case of creation mechanics. We put in the ideas we then experience. We place an idea file that is a monstrous consciousness. We experience that in our simulation. And according to additional agreement ideas in relation to such an agreement to an abrasive consciousness, will dictate to what extent we can be impacted adversely by an individual whose consciousness it was we agreed to incorporate into our simulated game. Again, the guides, life, and the real awareness would always protect any personal selves if it makes sense to do so, unless the individual needs such an experience maybe, but generally disruptive characters represent nothing of benefit. And so, what is necessary to deal with such individuals will be so, if the personal self allows and doesn't hamper the guides and life and the real awareness abilities through certain agreement particulars. In our recreated houses also, we can see the agreements to others that we are conscious or unconscious of, and not all will necessarily be of concern, in that intent of those we have these agreements with are not malign, although agreements and attachments retained with any personal self is agreement to an idea, which is a cause and effect restriction, and ensuring our retention in creation. We do, after all, have to get through and release all ideas, should we want to be tapline unshackled from creation. The agreements we are conscious of, personal self agreements, will feature on the first floor, as I said, and very often I will encounter Dwayne and other new friends on the first floor of my real side house, as agreement to them is not just on the real side, or real awareness to real awareness, being to being. As individuals preparing to begin their awareness processes are first approached on the real side, and agreement may be gleaned there, but the personal self may not be conscious of these agreements until they filter through, and so we would expect to see these interactions occurring on the second floor of these individuals' houses, that which they are unconscious of, and then to transition to the interactions being so on the first floors also, as agreement filters from the unseen parts to the parts of the personal self, to where the individual is conscious of them, the one-dimensional, physical level arena. And sometimes also attacks will be directly on the first floor of our houses, although, like any idea or intent would have begun in the other dimensions of life, as thought, etc. In this case, I was attacked seemingly by an individual who, although presenting as though regretful for doing what he was, nevertheless, this was his intention. Agreements in place then that would allow him to feature in my experience and simulation, as nothing can unless we have decided it, and these agreements can be conscious or subconscious, that which we are unconscious of, but that still facilitate the presence of the simulated situations from the ideas that individuals and their consciousness represent. Very often we also open ourselves up to attacks from others inadvertently, for as we face life, as we go about releasing all our tap lines, as we share and present the ears, we are engaging with created ideas, and the created ideas of the consciousness of others that will be interfused with other ideas and agreements. For as we engage with one individual, we agree with their consciousness and all that it comprises of, including any agreement and attachments with others they may have, and so we can expect these attacks and impositions through what I call backdoor agreements, as we go about our process of awareness. But everyone is the effects of themselves, of what they decide. Their simulation mirrors the ideas they create, and for individuals who choose to be abrasive, even if agreements allowed their presence, they will still experience that which reflects their choices, and the ultimate expression of effects that the controllers have to deal with, despite agreements to their control which have allowed them to do what they have, they will have to experience going into a darkness as the simulator deteriorates, unless they make better choices now. Karma or effects can be managed creatively. The dark forces can be displaced, contained, or even thrown into the phantom zone. Again, this is simply what they have chosen to experience through the choices they have made, the causes they have generated. This situation seemed along similar lines, for as this individual sought to attack me with a knife, either literally or representing a restricting idea he was forcefully trying to embed in me, so I encased him suddenly in a kind of a bubble, indicating my not agreeing with the imposition he represented, not accepting then to experience being assailed. A bubble that was no bigger than, say, a beach ball, and yet a bubble that contained the entirety of his decided consciousness simulation, that he would have experienced anyway, but as though he was locked in his simulation, and in such a way that he couldn't be abrasive to others consequently, almost as though contained, not like a phantom zone where you can't create, but a simulation of his decided illusions where only he featured. Interestingly, he seemed rather pleased with this situation, as though he realized what he was doing wasn't beneficial, but unable to help himself, as though possessed or influenced beyond any ability to control himself, like a kind of real side, mind-controlled Manchurian candidate. At that point, Peter, my father, entered the house, but my real awareness impressions assured me that it was in fact a real guide, assuming this form, as guides have a tendency to adopt the forms of older brothers and parental figures, and have an unmistakable isness standing sense about them, readable through the real awareness, as the personal self alone can only see the surface imagery, the simulation, the forms and body types, and not the intent, ideas, and inclinations behind the forms, that a real awareness can read, as it is through all creation and consciousness, and the personal self alone certainly can't recognize the isness, beingness of a real guide, as it is a true reality, only perceivable through that which is a part of it, that being the real awareness that we actually are, as the personal self is only designed to perceive the simulation it is designed to effect. The guide was rather indifferent to the whole situation, as though just electing to observe what was taking place, or to make his presence known. My agreement to him would allow that he always had access to my simulation and experience at any time, represented here as he could readily enter my personal self-house. I may have created the idea consideration of guilt, perhaps, for encasing this individual in this bubble, despite it really being a case of him experiencing the effects of his abrasiveness, just in a way he didn't expect. And so I would release him from this bubble containment, and he would fade away from the scene. But the guide seemed unconcerned, that if this was how I elected to deal with this situation, it was my decision, and really more so a means of protection afforded through my real awareness, as after all, my personal self didn't know how to simulate a bubble encase people in this fashion, and had simply taken on a few nonsensical ideas in response to the guide's presence, as though a child having misbehaved and been caught by a parent.
And the idea there too is, there's many, but yeah, you figure it out. And sometimes you got to do that. So, if a dog's going to be attacking you, sometimes you got to kick them or splash water on them, etc. So you have the right to protect yourself. That's for real. And you didn't hurt him. You were just keeping him away. So that's cool. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Kevin. As Dwayne says, our protection equals our awareness, and you seem to show him his intent, or something, you create the bubble, but kind of went. He saw his intent. He saw what he was doing through the bubble, and gave him a chance to reconsider or to consider generally. So it's kind of neat. The is has no weapons, you could say. There's no weapons with the isness. It's just awareness, but you can do a lot with awareness. You can do a lot with shifting and maneuvering, etc., where you don't need to really even be defensive or in that respect, but you can just use awareness because you have more options in a way. Now, in a practical way, in a physical way, we'll see how that comes out. But still, in the end, awareness supersedes everything, and it's basically your protection against anything, everything. Your survival is your awareness, including protection, if you want to call it that. So thank you. That was neat. Thank you.
This real side experience would open on a scene of the ocean. The only other feature would be a small boat floating on the water. The boat looked like one of those vessels that takes scientific instrument readings or conducts surveys. My view was a bird's eye one initially, from my real awareness, and I would move in closer to determine more details of this situation. The boat's crew became apparent, consisting of 2 younger women and the leader of this expedition, who was a far older man. I wasn't participating in what was taking place, just observing. Seems that part of their operation consisted of deep sea diving, although I would never discover as to the specifics of what they were doing. At one point, one of the women divers didn't surface after a considerable amount of time, and the other 2, the other woman and the older man, would dive into the water in an attempt to locate and retrieve her, for they must have assumed her to be in a spot of trouble or other. There was some danger to these waters, some deep sea menace or other, that the divers could only remain in its depths for a certain time period before returning to the boat. I had the impression of some kind of a monster, but would never see it, and not have visual clarification. For whatever reason, the elder man didn't require the diving, breathing apparatus. Unlike his two women associates, he had the ability to hold his breath for extremely long durations, although it seemed they could only remain in the water for several minutes or so at a time before whatever lurked in the water could be of threat to them. Generally, we might surmise they were operating from a standing reel with their real awareness position, but undertaking assignments that required a dipping into the psych realms, as it were, albeit briefly, beneath the surface of the sea here, having to activate and create through the personal self, to do what they deemed necessary on the physical, then once completed, surfacing and returning to the nowness of their real awareness, ensuring that they didn't remain with the personal self beyond what it was required for in creation, to not utilize its thoughts, emotions, to create recklessly, to create for a beneficial making sense with life, reason only, as the monsters, the ideas of creation, always are on the prowl, and should they seize you, should they claim the attention, agreement, and focus of your personal self, they can drag you down beneath the waters that represent the psych realms, and have you stuck in cause and effect creation, should a certain idea be enough of a distraction to take you off. Perhaps this was the situation with the woman who hadn't surfaced, always rather a tightrope and razor's edge as we go about our awareness process while in a physical vehicle, swimming in the sea of the monstrous ideas of restriction, and trying to keep from agreements that will drag us under. I would follow closely the goings on, even joining them on their dives, as they sought to find their lost associate. I lacked diving equipment as well, and at first my personal self panicked as a result, assuming it wouldn't be able to breathe. But after a while, I realized, of course, this wasn't a problem. On the real side, you don't have the same limitations that you are restricted by through the body vehicle design. The scene would switch, and I was now in the company of a group of becoming more aware individuals. With our group was a woman who naturally took the lead, as it were, for she was either a real guide or a very aware being. Very possibly she may have been Ava. Amusingly, the real guide had decided on a little role-playing and was assuming the identity of Doctor Who. She wasn't in the physical form of any of the actors who played the Doctor, for indeed there actually has been only one female actor for the part, Jodie Whittaker, but nevertheless she was adopting this identity. Her appearance was that of a very wise woman, with her sharp, intelligent features. She was slender and in her 60s, I would have said. She even had her own TARDIS that we all travelled around with her in. It had the standard central console in the main control room, as is typical with the TARDIS, as it has been throughout all the years it has featured on the television. Only this TARDIS was far more organic, almost as though made from nature itself. The central console itself looked just as organic. Indeed, I could see nothing technological about this TARDIS whatsoever, and yet it was no less effective for transporting us across creation, rather an indication of the real guide's complete support of the ears and standing with that reality, the ears that is represented by the all-natural environment through the life levels. And here we have a direct representation of how, if we allow it, if we stand real with it, the ears, the all-natural environment, has everything we need and supports us completely. We had the capability of going anywhere we wanted in our all-natural TARDIS, as we allowed the ears to support us. Through the support we afforded it, through standing in the reality that it is. Of course, no travelling is needed with the ears. Everything is in every new moment of its reality. Moving from point to point is strictly a cause and effect, time phase illusion of creation. But with these real side experiences, we can't just sit in the isness. For those who haven't recognized it yet, so would they be unable to see anything of what the ears was revealing, and rather a lack of recountable experiences would be the result. So we do need these experiences of travelling in spaceships and the idea of motion, so the personal self has something to relate to, understand, and become more aware through, and further comparisons for the recognition of the ears. And so here we were, in this all-natural TARDIS, with the real guide, Doctor Who. We did extensive travelling. We visited many places, alien worlds and such, rather a sight-seeing tour, as I'm uncertain we were actually doing anything of galactic significance at this moment, or if we were, I either didn't remember, or my personal self didn't receive that part of the experience. However, we did materialize in a huge spacecraft at one point. The ship was so large It was like a city floating through the stars of this creational realm, wherever in creation it was floating. And indeed, this spaceship was designed as quite literally a floating world. Everything you would require from a personal perspective was there. Your living quarters, all the places of convenience, etc. The crew were equally as vast in numbers, thousands upon thousands, maybe even 1,000,000 or so. Who could say for certain? Also, they were all of varied alien species and body forms, all living together in this giant spaceship. Generally, they seemed to get along, but just because they were aliens, with their super intelligences and technology, it didn't mean they were any more aware than any other less technologically sophisticated species. You would have your standard attitudes with an alien just as readily as you would with a human. But here we were, and we were well received, and my impression was that we were here on business predominantly, accompanying the real guide, galactic dealings, securing agreement, sharing the ears, bringing various alien groups and species on board, and this was our latest venture in that regard, as we were permitted on board this ship. And the advantage of engaging with a ship with such a wide assortment of aliens, that represents then a wide assortment of species, is that they would very likely then pass on the information, the offers, the proposals, and rustle up further agreement from their respective species and wherever part of creation they called home, an alien networking potentially. While we were here, we had to be checked out in the medical bay, as it seemed there was the possibility of our group having contracted a contagion or other. We all were scanned and run through various technology as it mapped our bodies internally for any anomalies. Maybe this was a standard procedure for visitors to this ship, for surely these aliens wouldn't wish to have any space viruses running rampant. And in fact, one of our group had some parasite or other that he had acquired on one of our assignments. It seemed to consist of some kind of worm that could be excited through the aliens' scanning technologies to emerge through the skin and then could be eradicated. The rest of the group were fine, though this worm or parasite could transmit its spores through a physical contact, apparently just by the touch of the skin of an infected to another's could the parasite be transmitted, and so we were advised to vacate the medical area. The infected individual would remain, though he was in safe alien hands. As we continued to accompany the real guide, we were given a brief tour of certain parts of the ship that the guide wished to see, or rather wished for us to see, for as a guide she would know everything already. We were in the company of an alien ship tour guide also, who would pass his hand over a panel, and a door hissed open. We would peer within the chamber revealed, and were met with a dimly lit area with a greenish hue. Lined along the walls were what looked like stasis chambers or pods, and within each of these was a particular species of reptilian. They were all identical, and maybe only their own kind could have differentiated one individual from another. All were green scaled, with lizard-like heads, etc. They had a particular look or design to their reptilian body vehicles that differentiated them from all other reptilian species. I can't exactly remember what that was, but just the impression that this was so. Real awareness afforded extra details, though I think their eyes were far larger than usual for a reptilian, almost like the eyes you see with grey aliens. Maybe these were more subterranean reptilians, as many aliens do live underground, sheltered from the inhospitable surfaces of destroyed planets, or at least maybe had evolved from a species that used to live underground. Either way, and hence the larger eyes required for better vision in ill-lit habitats. But anyway, the alien ship guide informed the real guide and our group that these very reptilians were a bothersome breed, and in fact they were riddled with the very parasites that had afflicted the member of our group. So maybe we had ventured onto the territory of this reptilian species during our assignments. Seems these reptilians were secured here in cryogenic suspension or something, a species of reptilian not very favourable with most other species, even other reptilians. I felt rather sorry for them. Evidently, they were held captive here against their will. As I said, we were dealing with attitudes of the personal self, with the captive reptilians and the alien captors, but it was their free will business, and we weren't here to interfere with their choices and decisions. It just seemed that the real guide wanted that we saw this, something to be aware of as to further happenings and what's occurring in creation. At one point, we had an audience with one of the higher ranked officers of the ship. If we encountered the captain at any stage, I don't recall, but this officer was a very arrogant, attitude-driven character. He also had a kind of subordinate. I don't want to really call it a pet, but he treated it like a kind of slave underling. This slave being was another reptilian. He looked like a walking bipedal crocodile, what with his very elongated snout. The reptilian was clearly sentient, intelligent, capable of speech, all 7 to 8 feet in height of him, and seemed rather accepting of his situation, for he had a kind of chain that was attached in multiple places to parts of his head, and the officer would lead him about by this chain, which quite clearly wasn't very comfortable. The reptilian would grimace, and was quite clearly in pain, as the officer dragged him along by the chains embedded in his crocodile face, and treated him like he was not a particularly beloved pet, more that it was a posturing on the officer's part, a show of might and ego, that he had such a fearsome reptilian subdued and on a leash. The real guide would conduct some business, as we and the group would sit in a large cinema-type room, sat in an audience before a large screen, as various aliens entered and took their seats. Very likely we were to be watching something that was to do with the galactic situations, maybe some real side documentary about the simulation we all were in, or something along those lines, was my impression. At this moment I had also adopted a robotic body form. Seems this kind of a body type, mechanical, was one utilized quite a lot in real side experiences at the time of this experience, and quite possibly may be an option even on the physical level. A far more efficient and durable vehicle after all, less vulnerable than a biological body that requires rest, needs to eat, and is more susceptible to the toxins and pollution it must wade through on a daily basis. The spaceship adventure ended there, but the scene did skip one final time to a more mundane setting, my house on the real side, and in keeping with the theme of my recounted real side experiences regarding my personal self representing house around the time of this real side experience, again there were further alterations being done to the house. I would suggest again it was the real guides making adjustments and moderations for the benefit of my real awareness, with my free will agreement. For there were a group of individuals on the roof, dismantling it in fact, and hurling all the roof tiles and debris into the street. My personal self then continuing to be lessened in the rigidity of its restricting consciousness design, and now it seems the roof that separates the personal self house from the real side was being removed. Dwayne has spoken of how there is a blending now of the ears and creation, as the ears is featuring in the creational simulator, and a lifting of the literal veil, so to speak, where there will be no difference or separation between creation and the ears, for those willing and deciding to see it, recognize and stand in the reality of the ears as it features in creation. this modification to my personal self-house, very much representing this, I would suggest a real preparation for this position as it becomes more so in creation, lifting the roof that effectively separates the personal self from the real side and the ears. No barrier now, other than a recognitional inadequacy on our part. Interesting too that I was clearing my front garden also, and this was along the same lines of a personal self modification, tearing down that personal self, and the alignment of my personal self-house and surrounding areas, street and garden, for the bigger picture, the preparations for what is to come. After my front garden clearing, I would find myself planting and tending to some flowers and shrubs that looked very alien indeed. These plants were almost alive in how they were animated and reacted to my tending of them, almost as though I'm even preparing my personal self-house and front garden for the various alien factors, like rolling out the welcome mat, as it were, by planting and placing in view that which would align with the aliens that we are working with, a kind of representation of agreement to my continued involvement with the alien races. Like rather attracts like, and represented here with my planting of alien plants that may be indigenous to their alien home worlds. So my street has been enlarged in previous real side experiences to allow greater access for all the individuals that will be entering my experience as I continue with my process and with the galactic projects. And now I am even adding alien plants as a gesture of welcome to my personal self-house, agreement for the various alien species on the real side and the physical also, as my front garden is a part of the personal self-house, and so very much would suggest agreement to physical alien encounters and situations.
Okay, how fun, Kevin. Yes, taking the tour and seeing what's going on there, the points of interest, etc. Because again, it's like positioning everybody, giving them the tour, and seeing what position they want to play in all of this. And as we set up, just like the Skypes and the different groups, etc., and do things on Facebook or whatever. See, we're planting things all out there, just like they have. We're doing the same thing, and we're utilizing what they've utilized, etc. So, but the big overall is, yes, we only have so much time. Actually, they only have so much time, etc. So everything's being prepared, and the boys see it, ReBisaR and boys see it. Basically how much time there is and what's going to take place, etc. But in the meantime, we just simply keep doing what we can. So letting people know that you want to step up, you want to do something more than just talk about it, but it is in the doing and that intent too, and to really hold to this, because there is nothing else. I was looking at just happened to look at an old group of several years ago, a bunch of people in it. And I never had read it before because I wasn't in that group, but it's still on my Skype. Some people, a few people here were there, and then Kelsey and others were there. And there was this fella, he was called Soothsayer Master. That was his identity. And he was talking about what I was presenting, and that it was a cult, and it was MK Ultra, CIA, and all this other nonsense, and that he was into permaculture and the natural environment, etc. Well, that's fine. I'm not concerned. His attitude was kind of like, well, you do it or you don't, you know, etc. And that's really what it is. Yes, you do this or you don't. There's no halfway. There's no, you know, straddling the fence, so to speak. You do it or you don't. You're going to step up or whatever. So it's like when you join the military, you're going to do it, or you're going to go AWOL, or you're going to just pretend to be the soldier. So like the sun shining, life is very real. So we're going through all this process, and it's a lot. It really is, because now we're aware of how much it takes to get through this. And actually, you're not even seeing it yet. All right? We're not even at the start yet. There's a whole lot. So anything that a person thinks, you got nothing. That's very real. You have nothing, because there's a whole lot more to come. And so until you're real there and you've got all the attitudes and the intent, etc., well, you're not. And to see this reality, you must see it more than the idea. So yes, that's terrific, Kevin. We're sporting them along, scene at a time, and yes, they have their attitudes because they think they're in control, just like the people in this world. They deal with bankers in the business world, and they are the know-it-alls, aren't they? They really know nothing, zero. They only know things according to the control of what has been created. That's all they know. They're in the prison yard, and they're dealing with it. It's all a bunch of nonsense. So
Maybe you can send me some of those alien seeds when they germinate, flower. I'll give you my address. But that's so new. We never had field trips like that in school. That's so cool. Trip on the spaceship, size of a city. And speaking of education, yeah, we don't get taught like to really expand our awareness, or intuition, or imagination, or insights, etc. We're just so literalized in our education and indoctrination. So this is cool. Listening to you gives people possibilities. You know, I mean, this is real. This is like people can do this. They can expand their awareness. You know, it's just very real. And bringing the is into creation. That I remember that was the goal of Dwayne's, and it's happening. I see that too. Where there's really no difference between, first of all, no difference between the real side and the physical. It's still the simulator, but then creation and the isness, that, you know, blending of the personal creation and the isness is quite intriguing, quite fascinating, and an adventure like no other. And the last thing I saw, you mentioned the virus, and in the tap lining, and how especially with the COVID right now, it's a huge tap lining event, and we don't see it. Or you saw it the other day in a real side experience, how people were mutants. They became mutants, and then they became the zombies. And it's kind of this series of how it goes, and you can see how that's going with here in the physical, with the virus and the fear and the tap lining, people agreeing to this idea and then being manipulated and led around by this idea. They've done a good job with it.
NUUU.